For Machiavelli, there are no principles without power. And this is, I think, what brings him into the light of many people in the modern day, is recognizing so often now we think of politics as simply a debate between people who generally share a moral vision or identity and are really only working out the fine details. But the reason Machiavelli becomes more and more relevant today is we find ourselves farther and farther from a shared moral vision, a shared identity, and therefore these small adjustments to ideology are insufficient. And we're seeing attacks on the actual order of things. And so for Machiavelli, it was really important that primarily you had that unified order first, and then inside of that enabled the building of virtue. He agrees with Aristotle that ultimately virtue is created inside community, that people cannot be virtuous in isolation. But for you to have community, first you must have order.
Greatly.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're here with Auron talking about Machiavelli, the 15th century Florentine diplomat, military leader, philosopher, and Machiavelli is having a bit of a moment right now, especially in the online space. Why is that?
Well, I think the rediscovery of James Burnham's work, The Machiavellians, has opened a lot of people up to not just Machiavelli, but many of the later thinkers that he inspired. Really, Machiavellian politics is a moment. It's a mode in which you have to exist when the common moral vision has broken down. And we are certainly in that moment now, I think, in the United States, or approaching that moment. So many people recognize the power of his thought, his ability to cut through much of the mystification of politics, and they want to apply his lessons to our current situation.
Okay. And so, I think maybe it might help to unpack the context in which he was writing, because I remember, when I read him for the first time, I read The Prince for the first time in college, being deeply scandalized, thinking, this is. I remember being like visibly, viscerally uncomfortable, in total shock. And then, about 10 years later, I went back and read The Prince, and I was like, wow, this is powerful, especially. When you even stack it up against, many other, even classical and Christian works, not setting morality aside, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek with Machiavelli, but when you're just reading it, it is a very commanding, gripping work that clearly is penetrating observations about, the nature of politics in a certain mode. So what is the context that would prompt someone to write a work like this?
Well, Machiavelli found himself in a situation where Italy was thrown into constant chaos. They were being influenced by many different powers, specifically the power of the church, the way in which the religious and political overlapped. Many of the Italian city-states were highly dependent on mercenaries or auxiliaries, forces that they did not themselves own, and this put themselves into a constant state of chaos. Machiavelli, if you read further into his work, reveals himself as someone who is really interested in Italy as a unified power, but really resented the fact that other peoples and other powers were able to constantly involve themselves. And so part of Machiavelli's project was attempting to demystify power and many of the constraints that had been placed around it and general political thought by what was at that point a rather sclerotic Catholic Church. We're obviously heading towards the Reformation, the Renaissance, all of these revolutions that are going to impact culture and faith. And Machiavelli, in many ways, is the precursor to that.
Okay. And so the Florentine Republic, what was the Florentine Republic like? What was Machiavelli's role in politics? And then what was the relationship between the Florentine Republic and the papacy at that point?
Well, Machiavelli, obviously, what we discover in Discourses on Livy is that he favors a republican form of government, but the Florentine Republic was ruled basically by the Medicis. And so there was a way in which it was cosmetically a republic, but often was not actually operating as such. But Machiavelli comes to his moment as a diplomat once the Medicis have been driven out of power.
Okay.
And he involves himself in politics, including the attempt to build his own force, which again is something that he is constantly railing about because of the failure of mercenaries inside the Italian city-states. That's a great triumph for him personally. And so he makes many of these achievements, though often many failures, but is driven out of power once the Medici's return in the Florentine Republic. In fact, his Republican sympathies get him into great trouble. He ends up being captured, imprisoned, he's tortured because he's seen as a threat to the possible Medici power. And that's why he ends up on his farm and he ends up writing these different treatises about how princes or republics should operate.
Okay. And so the Republican ideal of Machiavelli, where does that come from? Or, what is that ideal for him? And then the Medicis, was it sort of more of a aristocratic form, oligarchic form of government, or was it a monarchy? What exactly were they? Yeah,
they're operating through the manipulation of power, money, these kinds of things. Very much an oligarchy behind the scenes in a lot of ways. It's the dilapidated form of aristocracy, obviously. And so that is something that he spurned. He recognized that republics required the population to be virtuous, and that often kingdoms arose instead because those were required for order when the populations weren't able to rule themselves. But ultimately, he believed that the republic was the best option, but the fact that all of this was happening behind the scenes certainly rubbed him the wrong way. He wanted a true republic in the sense, and not one that is simply being manipulated by a family.
Got it. And then, when we think of kind of classical Roman republicanism, Cicero comes to mind. But there couldn't be, the experience of reading Cicero's On Duties is radically different than reading Machiavelli's The Prince. So who were the classical sources of republicanism that Machiavelli was inspired by? What did he make of Cicero?
Well, in a lot of ways, he's breaking from many of the ideas that were expressed in a lot of ancient philosophy. He understood that republics needed a certain level of virtue, but he often felt that the rulers of those different areas it needed to have the appearance of that virtue rather than necessarily always following it in every situation. And so his focus was more on the maintenance of security and glory rather than necessarily the individual constant virtue of the specific ruler.
Got it. And so with someone like Cicero, he doesn't believe that the tension between, what is expedient and what is virtuous, he sees Cicero, my reading of him is that these things almost always align, and something can't be beneficial if it's not actually good or virtuous. And Machiavelli, I think in some sense he would, a lot of emphasis is placed on the fact that the appearance, of virtue is maybe more important than the reality, at least in specific cases. But was there some sense of, was there any sense of an objective or underlining kind of constant morality that was a logic that Machiavelli believed was true?
Oh, absolutely. Machiavelli certainly had a belief in the way the world should be ordered and what was valuable. It was simply a very significant break from the Christian order of the day. In fact, one of the reasons that he draws on Livy as basically a secondary Bible is he wants to replace many of the modes and orders that had existed before under the more Christian understanding of the good. And a lot of what he did was appeal to the superiority of the ancient ways, the Roman ways in particular. And so he felt like Roman soldiers and Roman politicians, particularly an understanding of glory and honor as a central good rather than necessarily more Christian understandings, were really key. And so that's one of the reasons he was constantly hailing back to that.
Okay. And was his book, was it a shock to the conscience when people read it in his own day? Or did they have a sense of, this is kind of the way things have always been done, and he's just sort of putting his finger on it,
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely scandalizing at the time. In fact, the impact moves beyond Italy into other areas of Europe as they understand this rather Italian way of thinking about politics. But really, many of the insights he's drawing from, like you said, are things that had existed throughout history. Even Christian leaders had engaged in many of the things that he was talking about. But the difference was you never said them out loud. You always used them. You maybe said them as a commentator on something, or you said this as you put them in the mouths of characters, as many of the ancient philosophers did. You didn't express those things very directly. And not only does Machiavelli point out that these things are useful or that they ultimately win the day, but he expressly says that you should do them. He advises that you engage in them. So this was a pretty radical change.
Mm-hmm. So is the description of Machiavelli as a teacher of evil, do you think that's accurate, or is that overly simplistic?
I don't think it's entirely without merit. I would say that Machiavelli, very few people think of themselves as evil. And I certainly think that Machiavelli was, like I said, he was dealing with a Christian church that had created this very sclerotic order, very decadent in many ways. And so he saw himself as breaking people out of that. He saw that it had a negative effect, and he felt like he was doing good in that way. Also, that it had crippled many of the political efforts that he thought ultimately would benefit his people. And so he thought that by freeing them from that, he was doing good. So I would say he's a man motivated by goods that he thinks of as primary, but would not today, I think, or at least at the time, especially of a Christian understanding, really carry into what we would think of as moral behavior.
Okay. And then the sense in which Machiavelli, there's another debate about how much of his thought is a rupture from the past. I think there are ways in which it certainly is a rupture from the theory of much of the Christian tradition. Although, there's always kind of counterfactuals to that. Even someone like Christine de Pizan, who we're doing another episode on, has a whole section on how yes, the prince should be merciful. Yes, they should have, humanity, charity. There's a whole section that the prince needs to be feared. There will not be any justice in the regime unless the prince is feared. And she basically kind of harkens back to this classical image of this goddess of ruling, who has, in one hand, there's an olive branch, and there's another hand, there's a sword, and these things, even for her, for the Christian ruler, had to go together. But of course, if you're reading Augustine, or if you're reading Thomas Aquinas, Machiavelli certainly is a rupture. What about in comparison to the classical tradition? Because when I read, Xenophon, The Education of Cyrus, or when I read some of the ancient Chinese kind of advice to statesmen or rulers, it feels very Machiavellian. So how do you see him do you see him as a rupture, not only from the Christian world, but also from the classical world, or not necessarily?
Well, he's definitely making appeals, again, to what he feels are the virtues of the ancients. And so in that way, there's definitely more connective tissue. The pagan understanding of the moral good, I think, is something that he is regularly reaching for. For instance, Machiavelli talks about how ancient troops are superior to Christian troops because the ancient troops had to fear enslavement or death when they lost, as where Christian soldiers, they basically would have just lost the conflict, but they would not have been driven into slavery due to the understanding that that's not how you treated fellow Christians. And so he says this actually makes Christian soldiers weaker because they're unwilling to fight to the death because they don't fear the enslavement that would come afterwards.
Interesting.
And so I think that there is a way in which he bridges to the ancients, but even then, I think he is still creating a break with many who often still desired some general orientation to virtue when it comes to rulers, as where his break is more severe than many of the ancients who, even though he's appealing to their version of morality more often.
Okay. And then the relationship between establishing order, which, requires, or could require, depending on the context, a use of force, in order to establish an order that in some respects, especially in the ancient world, kind of preceded justice or freedom or things like this. How does Machiavelli advise going from a state of kind of political chaos and sclerosis to a state of order. I guess, what is that transition from the means that you might have to use to establish the order to something better? And,
Yeah, that's a big shift. For Machiavelli, really, there are no principles without power.
Okay.
And this is I think what brings him into the light of many people in the modern day, is recognizing, so often now we think of politics as simply a debate between people who generally share a moral vision or identity and are really only working out the fine details. But the reason Machiavelli becomes more and more relevant today is we find ourselves farther and farther from a shared moral vision and a shared identity. And therefore these small adjustments to ideology are insufficient. And we're seeing attacks on the actual order of things rather than simply the fraying of certain disagreements when it comes inside the current moral vision. And so for Machiavelli, it was really important that primarily you had that unified order first, and then inside of that then enabled the building of virtue. He agrees with Aristotle that ultimately virtue is created inside community, that people cannot be virtuous in isolation. But for you to have community, first you must have order. And so you must establish the order first and do what is necessary for that order first before you can then transition to a community in which virtue can be attained.
Okay. And what does virtue mean for Machiavelli?
Well, again, he lists a number of Christian virtues that you should appear to have, right? Even to the case where he talks about liberality, where he says it's really important to have this, but you should never be it. Like you should appear to have this virtue, but you should never actually practice it with your own money. You could do it with other people's money. If you have someone else's property or money, you can give that away, and that's a great way to do it, to appear liberal. But you yourself should never expend your own fortune, because you'll never achieve the actual reputation for this without bankrupting yourself. And so there are the virtues for him that you should appear to have, but he also, I think, has core virtues that he truly believes in. But again, these tend to be more based around honor and power, and being a bold actor. I think this is why often Machiavelli falls into the level of appeal that, say, somebody like a Nietzsche has, because it tends to be more of a will to power action. This is where value is found. He would still see it as virtue, but it is significantly different from the Christian virtues he suggests that you only appear to represent.
Okay. And then so the relationship between the rulers in a republican system and the citizens, is the education, the formation, the virtues of the elite class different from the virtues of the common person, or what's the relationship between the two?
Yeah, he thinks it's really critical that you have strong arms and strong laws that'll eventually allow you to cultivate the ability of the leaders to have the type of virtue that we're talking about. And so it is fundamental to recognize the average person does need to rise to a certain level of virtue for the republic to operate. But this is why I think he begins a tradition of elite theory, because he understands the importance of rulers to have a very specific grasp on power and cultivate virtues that are very different from, say, the operation of a merchant in any given time and place. And so he definitely recognizes that distinction between the common man and the ruler and the type of virtue that they should employ.
Okay. So if I think back to the relationship between Aristotle and Alexander the Great, there was this moment where Aristotle published one of his works. I don't know. I assume it was the Politics, could have been the Ethics. And it starts to gain some popularity. And Alexander, who had been tutored and mentored by him, says, wait, what are you doing? I think he actually writes a letter to Aristotle. You're giving away all of the secrets, of how to rule to just everyone who can read it, And I guess it's rumored that Aristotle said something like, well, I gave away the secrets, but, for those who know and have been educated, there's more there than sort of meets the eye. So in what sense does Machiavelli, because obviously a lot of what he says is just, it's shocking, it probably, like you said, caused sort of an uproar. So to what extent is what he say, is he speaking at face value, and what extent is there sort of the hidden meaning in his text?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the big reasons that Machiavelli is scandalous is he chooses to write in the vernacular and not write in Latin. So he's not veiling his prose for the the common audience. It's available for the average person to read in a way that we usually wasn't done. So it's not just that he's saying scandalous things in his own name, which is itself already a huge issue, but he's saying it in a way that the common people could read it. However, a lot of people, Leo Strauss most famously, believe that Machiavelli had a lot of hidden meaning built in there, that even the numbers of the paragraphs themselves carry a lot of weight. Some people say that Strauss overreads into those things, and so I'll leave people to make their own decision on whether or not they think that's true. But it's very clear that that he is that perhaps Machiavelli is the first Straussian in the sense that he's writing on multiple levels for multiple audiences. So the average person will absorb some of the more blunt things that are represented, but perhaps there are additional meanings. For instance, he talks about Moses being a conquering prince, but while he says we should learn things from Moses, we should also recognize that because he received his power from on high, actually, does he really deserve the credit for these things? And so one person could read this and say, oh, well, he's saying Moses is somebody to be admired and someone to be emulated, but someone who's reading a little deeper might actually see a dig at Christian or biblical traditions hidden inside of that.
Are there any other kind of esoteric readings of him that come to mind or stand out?
I'm trying to think of ones that are very particular. He does this two-step with Christianity very often. Those are the ones that come to my mind right away. Sorry, I don't have another example immediately loaded.
And then in terms of his own, I want to kind of talk through some of the elements of the Prince, but briefly in terms of his own, Christian or Catholic faith. I understand that he received last rites and he was sort of buried in a Catholic church. Is there any sense in which there was a sincerity to that, or was he just embodying his mantra, and invite the appearance of religiosity?
Again, very difficult to say. It's very clear that Machiavelli is directly challenging Christianity on many levels, that he is criticizing the Christian tradition. He says very specifically that he is attempting to introduce new modes and orders that seem to be outside of the Christian tradition. That said, obviously, he is still working heavily inside of it. He's obviously referencing the biblical tradition on a regular basis when he's attempting to justify things, the way that we should understand the world. He will bring the Christian tradition into many of those references. And so was he did he make his own personal complete break from Christianity? Was that all just, well, I'm Italian, so this is what we do, but it doesn't have any personal weight? Very difficult to know for sure, but it is clear that he had very serious criticisms and questions when it came to certain aspects of Christianity.
Got it. And then was there anything, so you talked about his sort of kind of his ends being kind of honor and, I guess glory in sort of the public realm. Was there, was there anything above politics for him, or not really? It was just kind of what you see sort of in your regime is kind of what you get.
I think the idea of being above politics itself would have been very confusing for Machiavelli. I think that these goods were a critical part, again, because he was hearkening back very often to these more classical traditions. These would have been the goods of the city-state. The pursuit of political glory would have been a very central aspect of the ancient Roman life. And so for him, I don't think that there necessarily needed to be those things above him, or that there weren't things that were outside of that, because really the political encompassed all of the important traditions that you should think about when you're taking action.
So at the beginning of The Prince, I think it's actually in the introduction, he gives this kind of moving, example of how he returns from kind of life on the farm and work in the city and kind of enters into his study, and it's here that he's like communing with the great minds from history. And it's just this gripping sort of line. And it's reminded me of something else that I picked up on throughout many of these conversations, which is that, the greats imitate the greats in the Western tradition. And especially for Machiavelli, kind of studying and embodying and imitating the lives of other, great men in particular, that's sort of the secret, the logic to kind of achieving greatness. Do you have any thoughts on that? that point?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. A large amount of what he does is look at great men and how they acted, or great mistakes that they made, and how we should, how we should embody these things. Thomas Carlyle, of course, famously wrote on heroes and hero worship, and in that he looks at the different archetypes of different rulers. Some of the ones that Machiavelli will reference, I believe, at one point. But he talks about how civilization really is, the core of civilization is this ability to imitate, to take on these archetypes, to wear them ourselves. And so for Machiavelli to become a great ruler is in many ways to adopt these archetypes, to understand that by living out many of these examples, we can adopt these things, but we should also never do so completely uncritically. We should recognize when these failures occur, even inside great men, and adopt them. But yeah, from Caesar is being aped by Napoleon, and Caesar is aping Alexander the Great. This chain goes throughout civilization, and Machiavelli recognizes that.
And who were some of the archetypes for Machiavelli?
Well, again, he talks about Moses, he talks about Alexander, he talks about Cyrus, he talks about many of his contemporaries as well. He talks about the actions of Caesar Borgia and others. And so he brings a mix of old and new on a pretty regular basis. The biblical examples, classic Roman examples, and then also actors who are very contemporary to what he's doing.
Okay. So let's talk about the prince a little bit. One of the things he says at the beginning is that, it's very important for the prince to understand the art of war, war, military strategy. This is the thing that the prince should always be thinking about. Why is that for Machiavelli?
So Machiavelli understood two things. One, again, because order was a prerequisite to civilization, he understood that the monopoly on violence is critical to any civilization. He also puts a great emphasis on owning the arms yourselves. Again, he's very, very skeptical of mercenaries and auxiliaries. He understands the need for the prince to be able to wield his own troops, and he believes that no soldier will ever really respect a prince who does not himself have that martial prowess, does not, or at least understand how to command it. And so he understands the central nature of the prince, not just to have those skills, but be able to wield people who also have them. Because if you aren't the one that's doing it, why would the people who can do it respect you, right? That's something he brings up very specifically, is that no soldier would ever respect a leader who did not have command of that himself. And so it's important for him that you always have a direct power over those arms, that the arms are your own. He says specifically, all unarmed prophets fail and all armed prophets succeed. Okay. And so he recognizes the importance for you to not rely on the martial prowess of others, but that when force is wielded, when violence is necessary, that you have very direct command over it.
Okay. So then the relationship in a republic between the prince, so the army then and the arms would belong to the individual prince and then not to the regime as a whole.
He understood that, for instance, he brings up the Swiss and them being armed. He recognizes that if the citizen militia is your core, then those people are going to be naturally free because the arms are their own. They don't have to rely on others. And so he recognizes the importance of that. And he also recognizes that a ruler who arms the people will normally have their loyalty in the way that a ruler that attempts to disarm them won't. Okay. And so he recognizes that even, so in a Republican government, obviously you're not going to have a prince, but you're still going to have leaders. You're still going to have elites that rule. And so if they are ones that have distributed and maintained a armed citizenry, one that is virtuous and competent in the military aspect, then they're ones that are going to be freer and more confident in their rule.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to, I guess, think about take our own context as an example, we have a situation today where, essentially the armed forces kind of they're almost sort of maintaining an empire kind of on autopilot, and you see this even, anything happens anywhere in the world, and immediately probably in many cases, maybe even before you hear anything, even from the president or from Congress, you hear about the ships being deployed.
Yes,
it's just like it happens automatically, And so, at the end of the Trump administration, you had there was some executive order to pull the troops out of Afghanistan. The order basically made its way over to the Pentagon, and they're like, what? We don't have to do this. And it just kind of got ripped up or got ignored. So you have this situation. Now, I don't know if maybe that's less true if you have a president that is fully bought in on kind of the current kind of worldwide hegemony, of the United States. Maybe there is a greater kind of synthesis. They do, the armed forces does what the president or Congress tells them to do because they're all just generally on the same page. But how would Machiavelli say, if you find yourself as a leader, a ruler, a prince, president, whatever, in a situation where the armed forces really aren't under your control, or at least, I think your common enlisted soldier is pretty committed to even a sort of a constitutional American regime, but sort of there's the layer above them that's not necessarily. And so what do you do in a situation like that?
It's a great question because he warns specifically against this in The Art of War, which is probably his least read major work. But he says specifically that standing armies are dangerous for this reason, that a republic should not keep a standing army, even though they should arm the troops, arm the citizenry. The citizenry should be a citizen militia, and that's what they should go to war with. They should not maintain a professional troops, specifically for the fact that they will separate themselves from the good of the people. They will ultimately seek wars and conflict for their own good because that has become their employment. And so that's the only way in which they can continue to enrich themselves, advance their interests, these kind of things. And that was recognized by the founders as well. In fact, if you read the Federalist Papers, one of the cases that Hamilton has to make over and over again is that it's okay to go ahead and allow the federal government to be able to call up state militias, because if we do that, we won't need to have a standing army and we can avoid all the dangers of a standing army. Now, later on, Hamilton went to create a standing army for the United States. So he's talking about both sides of his mouth, but he understood the dangers and he knew that the American Republic, those who were founding it, recognized the dangers. And he specifically spoke about the type of danger that Machiavelli recognized to try to pacify those that were signing on to the new Constitution. And so one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, can a republic continue to exist in spite of a large standing army? And I think that ultimately the answer for Machiavelli and the founding fathers originally was, no, it can't. And the fact that we've allowed that to be created and to be separated from the citizen is a real issue. We think about the Second Amendment and we say, oh, well, it is primarily about self-defense. We often break from its militia roots to try to counter some of the arguments of the left. But I think that's a mistake because it allows us to forget the lessons of both Machiavelli and the founders, that ultimately the armed people are there because they are supposed to be virtuous enough to defend themselves.
That's right. So then what do you do about it, right? We may not want the standing army. We might want to return to sort of a more Republican sense of citizens being armed and calling up militias and, more self-government. But we have a standing army. And also, we also are facing other rival powers that have standing armies. And so to some extent, you have to compete with them, So do we just kind of, can you just make your peace with it and find some way to exert more authority over this behemoth?
No, it's a real quandary. Something that I work on in my book, The Total State, is that the massification of combat of states really does drive us towards this conclusion that ultimately we might have to abandon the Republican form in order to continue to exist in their geopolitical situation. I think if we want to take steps back, the first thing to do, like you said, is to reduce those global commitments as much as possible, to roll back the empire as much as we can, and at least bring the military back to its original purpose, which is actually defending the United States of America and not just exerting our ability to have access to, processors created on some island in Asia. And so I think that's the first step is reducing the military commitments to a point where we could have the option to at least say, well, if we're going to maintain a standing army because it's a necessity of the modern state, but we are no longer needing to project power globally, and so we can go ahead and take away some of those forces, reduce the number of forces, reduce the amount of money and power commitments to those forces, and invest a little more of our faith in the ability of the common American to defend themselves should, in the unlikely event that there's some kind of ground invasion on the continental United States.
Got it. Okay. So I think that makes sense. getting back to the prince, Machiavelli talks about the danger for a prince or a leader coming to power with the elites kind of being the ones that pull the strings, as opposed to coming to power riding the popularity of the people. And there's a couple interesting things with this. One, he says, if you come to power with the elites behind you, you're always an equal to them, and so when they want something, you're going to feel like you have to maybe give it to them since they got you there. But when you come to power with the people, there's an inequality to that relationship, and so you don't necessarily feel that same demand. There's another thing here, which is something that I see in many other kind of great leaders, is that there's actually a kind of a connection or a communion between the leader and the people, and often they're fighting against the elites. And so even especially in, let's say, the Byzantine Empire, you had someone like a Justinian who very much had this sense of what I think you could describe almost like aristopopulism, very populist, close connection to the people, and always battling these entrenched financial or aristocratic interests. So I don't know. Can you unpack maybe what's going on there?
Sure. So this phenomenon that Machiavelli originally identifies is one that has now come to be known as high and low versus middle.
Okay.
And so this is basically the way that all entrenched distributed powers are seated through, or are unseated throughout history, more or less. Is you have the new sovereign, or the prospective king, the high. You take the people and their interests, the populace, the low, and you use them to leverage out those that have been oppressing the low and challenging the high, which is that aristocratic base. In some ways, that has been used against the American people. We have seen the centralized government power importing a large amount of foreign peoples into the United States, promising the world, often by draining the wealth of the middle class, the American middle class, the kulaks, and that high and low versus middle has actually been used to attack the people of the United States in a lot of ways.
Okay.
But I think we are now in the position where actually the distributed power is that of kind of this oligarchic, progressive managerial class. And so that gives us the opportunity to create that high and low dynamic ourselves, which is why you see someone like Donald Trump drawing on that populist energy, because a lot of people recognize that even though Donald Trump is very clearly not a man of the people, in the sense that he just came out of the lower classes, he's a man for the people and is able to wield their energy and their will as a way to break the monopoly that currently exists in that oligarchic managerial class. Okay.
And does Machiavelli have anything to say about, so one thing that I guess, one challenge that I think, someone, like Trump faced during his first administration and might face in a future administration, is that, if all of the elites are against you, you're in a really tough position, because the high and low versus middle, like to some extent, I think that can work. But I almost feel like if you're going against every single elite faction from financial interest on Wall Street, and against Silicon Valley, and against the media, and against the academy, and against the military, and, on and on and on, that's a tough fight to win, unless you have, not just, 48% of the population. I mean, I don't know what level of majorities you would need to be able to fight that battle, but it would, it better be like a lot, 60, 70, 80%, in your camp. So would Machiavelli say, I guess, in a situation like this, and maybe we're seeing this now with some of the kind of, maybe there's a distinction between the managerial class and the creative class, some of the Elon Musk or David Sachs types kind of aligning themselves with sort of this nationalist movement that behind Trump. So do you have to, would Machiavelli say, you actually in this case kind of have to peel away some elites and get them in your corner in order to kind of reform, or, the system? Or what would he say about how?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. One of the key things, like you said, is that there's never a complete turnover of elites. In fact, one of the guys who followed in the Machiavellian tradition, Valfredo Pareto, talks about the circulation of elites. And he says this very specifically is, whenever you have a shift in elites, a circulation of elites, there will always be a certain percentage of the elite class that is still maintained, that is retained by power. The key, like you said, is peeling off those that can't currently succeed in the current order. So for instance, Julius Caesar, maybe he didn't want to be a populare, right? But he knew he couldn't do what he wanted to do as long as the optimates were in power. And so he recognizes that he has to draw on those people, but it doesn't completely replace every elite. In fact, he's very forgiving for many of the elites that understand that they want to be part of his rule once he starts obtaining power. And I think the same thing has to happen here. A lot of people get very wary about Elon Musk and Sachs and others because they're not completely aligned with the right wing or the conservative project. But it's critical to remember that most of those guys are pushing against power because there's something about the current order that prevents them from achieving their goals. Elon Musk is never going to Mars under Joe Biden and the Democratic regime, and he recognizes that. So even if he's not 100% on board, he's willing to go ahead and become very sympathetic to the interests of the populist movement while maintaining his elite status. And so it is important to unmake the elites that you cannot control or you cannot convince, the ones that are completely bought into the system, to make new elites that are loyal to you, but also to retain the elites that are currently there that are interested in shifting the order as they see it now.
Okay. Is that shift, like, is this something that, it happens very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, and then all of a sudden it just shifts, when they see that, oh, wow, that we're on the wrong path, we're going to lose our power and influence, time to shift over? Or how does that happen?
Yeah, it really is different in every era, and sometimes it can be rather sudden, but often it is in the mode that you're talking about. You usually see a building of a preference cascade where, someone like Elon Musk might have been happy to operate under the regime of 10 or 20 years ago. He would have been able to find a way forward, but simply again, we could get this sclerotic nature of institutions just makes it impossible for him to operate. And so slowly it becomes clear that whatever his disagreements might be with the right or the populist movement, those are much less important than the disagreements he has now. And you see him directly going after you're not just the system in the United States, but also the UK is directly challenging power in those areas. And that's one of the strange things that Machiavelli probably couldn't have foreseen, is the way in which soft power can spread itself across multiple continents. Because what we have now is an entrenched elite that doesn't exist just inside the United States, but exists across the globe. And the ability of a counter elite like Musk in that critical linchpin position of owning a source of communication and frankly propaganda gives him an unparalleled advantage in our current age.
So right now you have so you have the nation state, right? But you also have other layers above it. And those could be, social networks with technology. They could be, companies that are spanning the entire globe. And these things, maybe it's militaries that are our own military that's kind of operating across many nation states. So I guess, was that always the case in the sense of, you maybe had the Catholic Church and there was sort of an imperial influence of the church that crossed over many nation states? Or do we find ourselves in a very different situation where just the regime, the polis, is just one piece among these many layers that are exercising power?
One of the reasons that I called my book The Total State is that it is a creation that is both very old and very new. And so the idea of the nation state as we understand it, where it collapses all these other spheres of identity and sovereignty into the formal state, and the nation and the state become one, is actually a relatively new invention. Of course, you had the city state, which is something that Machiavelli would have been very familiar with, obviously. And that's the one in which the people and the city are the same thing, right? But then you have these imperial creations where you move outside of city-states. Multiple city-states or multiple peoples are ruled by one city-state, and we create the imperial presence. Christianity, as you say, becomes its own kind of hyper agent. It acts on top of the nation or the city-state, the people, binding a lot of people together, creating a level of cooperation, but also animus that did not exist previously. And kingdoms, of course, were creations of often many peoples. And so these are very different arrangements that wouldn't necessarily be understood in a modern context. So I think what we're seeing is the return to this less very clearly defined understanding of what the nation and the state are. And that means that we have the attempt by many of our total states to collapse everything back into one governance, right? One state. But in many ways that is failing due to the level of digital and cultural disruption that exists now. And so I think what we might see, what is a possible future, is a refracturing of these totalizing systems back into a more organic, competing, overlapping sphere of sovereignty that existed in previous times.
Okay. And would that be based on the nation state or more regional, like blocks?
Very difficult to tell at this point. I think it's really anyone's guess. One of the main problems we have at this point is we have encouraged people to deracinate so thoroughly that the origin of the nation, in this case, when we say nation, we mean a people, not a government, not the state. Those people have been spread so widely in many scenarios that the idea of the geographical nation doesn't exist in the same way it did before. So maybe we'll see a refounding of nations along more ideological or religious identities. Maybe we'll see them along forms of government organization or even technology. These are all open to us now, and I think that makes these very exciting but unstable times.
What was Machiavelli's view of empire, and is that compatible with certain Republican principles, or is it necessary? How did he understand that?
Again, he warns that the empire the imperial republic is one that is inherently unstable. That its constant need to seek out sources of income, to bring in new peoples, to bring in new power, will always introduce a level of instability as you're bringing in new peoples, new languages, new cultures, and those will have their own modes and orders. He talks specifically about in I believe The Prince, about how when you're going to go capture another people, if they already speak the same language, if they already have the same custom, if they already have the same religion, that makes it something that is more easy to do. The transition is less harsh. But if you're going to capture people that do not have those aspects, you really need to occupy them. He says very particularly, you need to send colonies, you need to live there. These are the things that will allow you to basically integrate and control these in a very in a way that somebody like Alexander recognized. And so for him, imperial republics are inherently unstable, but possible as long as you probably recognize that you need to keep that expansion circumspect to the people that share, again, religion, history, language.
What about is there so in one sense, empire could be, something that's universal and so very far flung. Would he advise establishing some sort of regional hegemony where is that something he would recommend? Well,
this is the classic mode of empire, right? The idea today, one of the problems with the propositional nation is the idea that we can just take our ideology and paste it on to other peoples and make them part of our own. And he recognized that that wasn't necessarily the case. This was what most people throughout antiquity understood. You had a Roman Empire, but for the most part, they didn't directly change the religion and the ideology and the governments of every one of their different areas. They allowed the local powers and customs to stay in. They allowed that history and tradition to continue to rule for the most part, as long as the satrapies were kind of kicking back to the empire, paying their taxes, bringing their levies, these kind of things. And so I think that that's the way Machiavelli would have understood it. If you're going for this imperial model outside of those that speak your language, share your religion, have your traditions and customs, you need to recognize the very different way in which they have a manner of being. And if you're going to administer, if you're going to have someone be an administrator there, it should be someone who's at least connected to those people in some way.
Got it. Okay. So, one of the most famous lines from Machiavelli's The Prince is that, basically it's better to be feared than loved. Ideally you're both feared and loved, but if you can only pick between one of the two, you're better to be picked to be feared. Why is that the case?
Well, again, he recognized the importance of the fact that people will betray you if they think that you are only, if they only love you. If they recognize advantage, if they don't fear anything that they can lose, ultimately they will choose their own advantage over you. Machiavelli recognizes that people are ultimately fallen and bad, and so that they will choose their own well-being over and over again. But he's also careful to make a distinction between feared and hated. They're not the same thing. He says very particularly that, for instance, the creation of strongholds and fortresses to protect yourself against the people is a huge mistake, because ultimately, if someone truly hates you, if they're truly holding a vengeful hatred against you, and they're willing to sacrifice their own life, no fortress will stop them. You will at some point have to leave your fortress. You will have to open yourself up to the public, and at that moment they can take your life. And so while it's important to be feared in the sense that they recognize your ability to reach in and punish bad behavior, you do not want to cultivate a long-term hatred, because those long-term grudges will create a scenario in which you are never safe, no matter how much power or arms you wield.
As I think about our own moment, that kind of fixating on that line about not being hated, the danger of being hated, that's another aspect that I guess unsettles me, I guess, with our current moment, because I'm obviously, very sympathetic to kind of this populist reaction to the elites. But part of also what makes me nervous is kind of there's a certain engendering of hatred that is so strong for conservatives attempting to kind of, lead the populist energy towards something that's more constructive. So, is that, let's say the hatred that might be expressed in the American public for Donald Trump, for example, is that something that would, is that something, I guess, that's just unique to him as an individual? Or could you just expect, 10 years from now, if someone's continuing to lead a sort of effort, no, the hatred is just going to be displaced? And how do you cool a hatred? How do you actually cultivate the love of a majority? Because I am worried that the hatred could sink the project.
Well, I think the important thing to remember, the good news, is that the hatred that was built up towards Donald Trump is a large part of media creation. We obviously just saw an attempt on former President Trump's life, and we don't know all of the details. I think very specifically because the powers that be don't want us to know all the details. But one of the things you have to imagine is that the fact that the media routinely says that Trump is an existential threat to democracy, that he's basically Orange Hitler, there's a large amount of effort, of constant propaganda required to build the type of hatred that we see for somebody like Donald Trump. But it's important to remember that it's not just for Trump. I think the truest thing that Donald Trump has probably ever said is, they're not after me, they're after you, and I'm just standing in the way. And I think that's what most people who support Trump recognize at this point, that actually the ruling elites and those that they're manipulating through the mass media, oligarchy, they really do hate the average people of the United States. They really do hate middle America, heritage Americans. They have been trained that these people are dangerous, that they're an existential threat, that at any moment they're looking to, establish another Reich, and this is truly what they believe. The good news is that I think without the constant manipulation of the media, the simple fact that most of middle America is actually like the heart of America, they're good people, they are kind people, they are the people who are contributing, that will win people over. But that does mean that we have to wrest control of the hearts and minds of Americans away from this constant deluge of propaganda that's being created.
Getting back to kind of the feared and being loved. So this advice that he's offering, it's obviously for leaders, for rulers, right? I'm wondering what, he's talking about the relationship being feared and loved with the context of a government. What about in the context of family? What about in the context of friendship? Is he saying that all of the logic that would apply to advice for a prince applies in your own personal relationship with friends and family? Or is there a genuine possibility for love, sacrifice, friendship in Machiavelli's morality?
Well, obviously he made some choices in his own marriage and other scenarios where there was betrayal. And so you could say, I suppose, that his own personal morality did not hold to what we would think of as a Christian ideal, to be sure. I do think that there is a great differentiation between the way that rulers should act and the way that individuals should act. And he recognized this. He understood that what made a ruler what they were was that they were able to act in these scenarios, make these decisions in a way that the average person would not. So he understood this distinction. However, I wouldn't say that these are entirely separate, of course. It is important that, the father is a reflection of God, and God is both feared and loved.
Sure.
And so, one of the reasons a father establishes physical dominance early over, say, a son is so that the son understands that he should not be harming, he should not be disobeying, say, his mother, someone who cannot exert a physical dominance. But later on, you should not need to do that, because ultimately you should cultivate a love and a care that shows that those decisions being made are on your behalf. And so I think there are lessons to be understood. There is the relationship between ruler and ruled in some instances is a father to son relationship. And so we can take some of those lessons while understanding that there are distinct things about the rulers in a political sense that should not be carried into the family.
Okay. So then at the very end of The Prince, he's talking about the role that fortune plays in making princes great. And, he kind of uses some dramatic kind of allegories. But, one of the things he says in particular is that when fortune wants to make a prince great, she brings enemies before him, throws obstacles in his path so that he can climb these as a ladder to greatness. And there's a sense in which, the prince isn't just a passive character and fortune is just doing everything, right? There's an interplay between the two. The prince is actually kind of cultivating fortune and better to be impetuous than be cautious. You have to kind of be someone who seizes the day. So what is the relationship? Well, first of all, I guess, what is fortune to someone like Machiavelli? And then also, I don't know, how is fortune distinct from providence? And then to what extent can you channel fortune, and to what extent are you just a passive receptacle of it?
Yeah, so Fortuna is very heavily featured in Machiavelli's work. One of the things that he wanted to break from was this idea of, I think, constant divine intervention. And I think he wanted to see people take more action, more agency over what they're doing. However, he was very far from discounting the role that fortune plays. He talks about how it's a significant factor in everything, and ultimately, while you can be a great actor, if fortune just simply does not favor you, then you will run into these disasters. You will lose. And in fact, that seems to be one of his side jabs. If you were asking previously about the different levels at which he wrote, he would say Caesar Borgia did everything right, but fortune just didn't work out for him. And it's like, well, is that a dig at Caesar Borgia? Is he ultimately saying that he's a failure, or is he really saying that fortune did just simply rob him of those things? You can read it that at multiple levels. But fortune for Machiavelli is something that is a significant factor, but ultimately must be mastered. In fact, one of his lines that is incredibly politically incorrect today was that you must treat fortune like a woman and beat it down often and severely. And like a young man, you should do it with additional vigor, because then she will respect you more. And so his understanding was that fortune is a massive force, but it is one that is ultimately to be mastered. And to just throw out the common phrase, fortune does ultimately favor the bold, and it is those that master it, that rise to those occasions, that you, like you said, when the challenges are thrown before you, you go ahead and master them, and you make fortune your servant. You will ultimately be the great leader. So he understood it had a huge role. He said you should always factor this into the way you act, but you should never blame it. Should never become a scapegoat for your own failures. Ultimately, the great ruler is one that turns fortune to his favor when he can, seeks those opportunities, meets greatness whenever those opportunities arise.
Yeah, and Harvey Mansfield actually makes an interesting point. You touched on that allegory of sort of the rape of fortune, and Harvey Mansfield asked the question at the very end of his introduction. We should ask, who is actually raping who? And perhaps it's fortune is the one who is striding across history, victorious over all of these striving princes.
Right.
So there are many ways to read that. The discourses on Livy, in some respects, I think you've said that's actually a more important book than The Prince, even though The Prince is the one that everyone has to read in school. What's the central argument, or what's going on in the discourses?
Well, again, so the discourses, the Machiavelli is in The Prince, a much shorter work, making these references again to antiquity, to biblical tradition, to the present. But in Discourses of Livy, we see a much broader, longer project in which, and Leo Strauss makes this argument, that Machiavelli slowly turns Livy into his Bible. He uses Livy to displace perhaps these religious and biblical traditions in a way that is not quite as evident as it is in The Prince. There's more of a systematic replacement. But also we see that Machiavelli then himself intentionally misquotes Livy in different places. He manipulates some of the historical events to make his own points. And so in the Prince, we simply get, I think, a more focused gloss on kind of his political understanding. But in Discourses on Livy, I think we get a wider understanding of his attempt to instantiate modes and orders, new modes and orders, and the way in which he thinks he's justified in doing that. And also, of course, we also get a truer understanding of what he believes to be the superior creation of a republic as opposed to a principality. So I think those are some of the big distinguishing changes between The Prince and the less read discourses.
Okay. So as we kind of move forward to the present day, you recently wrote a book, The Total State. To what extent did you draw on insights from Machiavelli when formulating your argument?
Well, obviously, Machiavelli is the beginning of what we call Italian elite theory. It's the beginning. It's the founder of this kind of elite tradition, and this realpolitik tradition. And so he's at the center of these things, but also he inspires thinkers like Gaetano Mosca, like Vilfredo Pareto, who I also draw on very heavily. One of the big things that is done by Machiavelli at his time is really freeing philosophy and particularly political understandings from what at that time was a heavy mystification of what he saw as an incorrect ideology. And so one of the things that I try to do in the book, and I think is essential for us to do now, is to ourselves free our political order and our philosophy from the mystification that currently exists. We live not in a Christian society in the way that he did, but in a specifically humanistic progressive society, which imposes very similar constraints, but has also grown very sclerotic and decadent in the way that he felt Christianity had. And so there's a shift that we can use in a very similar way that he did by demystifying those operations.
And would you say that that our current regime is just as enchanted with sort of some sense of mystical ideology and myth and ethos as the old, the Catholic societies in the Middle Ages?
Oh, much more severely.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there were problems with Catholic society at the time, and being a Protestant, I feel like many of those got addressed. But they were at least grounded in a version of eternal truth, right? For whatever their failures at that time, the order still understood virtue. It was still oriented towards the good in a certain way. It still was tied to these biblical truths. Today, what we see is really the unmooring of Christianity entirely from Christ. And that's really what progressive humanism is. It's the attempt to completely disassociate Christian values from Christ himself, from the biblical tradition. And so the attempt to do that is highly ideological. It has to be, because everything is built in these very artificial terms. And so it's critical for us to, again, demystify these areas, especially when it comes to the operation of politics, because so many Christians even have bought into these progressive mystifications of the way that our politics and our philosophy should work. And so there's a lot of work to be done just bringing Christians back to an actual Christian understanding of the way that society should be ordered.
So, I think some of our listeners, in one sense, we're talking about, the Christian understanding of ways society should be ordered. In another sense, right, there are positive things that we're drawing from Machiavelli here. So I think, perhaps it's simplistic, but I think one response or pushback is, so are you basically just telling Christians that they need to, lie a bit more, be a little more ruthless, use some deception, and that's the means by which they reestablish, some sort of Christian order, and won't that ultimately corrode that use of power in that way, corrode the Christianity that you're trying to cultivate? What do you say to that?
I don't think that's the case. I think it's Patrick Deneen who said Aristotelian ends by Machiavellian means, right? And in a way, I think that's really what we're looking at here. I think that we can take lessons from Machiavelli on how to subvert a political order while installing something that is much better, much more vibrant, much more organic and grounded in the good and the beautiful and the true than perhaps the modernistic order that followed Machiavelli's actions. It's also important to remember that much of Christendom was not installed on winsome arguments. Charlemagne did not convert the Saxons but with really good arguments. Charles Martel did not repel Islamic invaders by just having a really good grasp on biblical truth. There is ultimately a military order. There are hard choices that had to be made by rulers that installed the Christian order that we appreciate today, that in many ways we want to restore. And we shouldn't ignore that fact. We should understand that ultimately the argument that I make in my book is that we have corroded our understanding of politics because we have needed to massify it, because we've had to make the personal political in every sense. And we have assumed that the hard choices that rulers make are also the exact choices that every person who casts a vote makes. And that should not be the case. And I think when we shift that understanding, then we can place ourselves in a position where we can make certain Machiavellian inspired choices while making them towards restoring a version of the good, the beautiful, and the true.
So that the burden of the weight of figuring out how do you respond to this ideology is not crushingly placed on every single human being, because that's a ton.
I don't think Walmart cashiers should have to make a choice between Aristotelian or Machiavellian operation. I think that there should be an understanding that we can cultivate individual and communal virtue with the average person while also shifting very difficult choices more onto political elites who are ultimately the ones who will make those decisions anyway.
So you've described America as a theocratic empire, I believe.
Theocratic oligarchy.
Theocratic oligarchy. Okay, not empire. So you were theocratic oligarchy when I was talking with Patrick Deneen. We're talking about America as a progressive empire. How do you begin these reforms if the bones and the structure and the water that you're swimming in is a theocratic oligarchy or a progressive empire? How do you? And also, how do you start to build on a solid foundation if the whole boat is, feels like it's rotting, but also, so I guess and then what is the end game, the end game, is a restoration of the founders' republic? Is it something that draws largely from those founders' insights, but in light of certain constraints of the modern state ends up looking a little bit different? What's the end game, and what are some of the means or tactics that could be used by a virtuous, statesman?
There's a fantastic passage from Alexander Dugin where he talks about how modernity is really the question of the death of God, and post-modernity is the question of the death of who, because so many people have
death of what?
The death of who, because so many people have forgotten that they are supposed to be angry at God, that they are once again opened up to questions of religious truth because they no longer carry the baggage and the weight of what came before. And I think we're seeing that in many instances. A lot of the younger generation are those that recognize that the current progressive order is spiritually dead. It has a lot of empty religious rituals you're supposed to go through. It offers you all these artificial identities, but ultimately it's nothing. There's just nothing there. And this reintroduces the option of offering them truth, to offer them a biblical truth, a Christian truth, something that is grounded in the transcendent. And I think that is a massive thing that people don't recognize. Is this? I think there is a moment of somewhat spiritual revival, even if it's not on a large scale. Communities can cultivate this in a really important way. That means that I think we need to recognize scaling things down is the way to go. Looking to build virtuous communities again, creating these high trust but smaller units of social organization is going to be important moving forward. Whatever happens, we will all be post-liberal. We will all be post-modern in a sense that we will have moved through modernity and we'll be looking for something that integrates the past, the things that we care about, the tradition that conservatives want to bring forward in Christianity and Christendom, but we'll also have to marry that with the things that we've learned about the modern world. We will all have been affected by modernity when we apply those lessons. And so does that mean that we'll rebuild the Republic of the Founders? Possibly, but even the founders understood that republics had to have a shared moral vision, right? John Adams said the Constitution is for a moral and religious people. It doesn't work for any other. We can't operate an empire of over 350 million people across multiple continents on a republican system. That's not how republics are supposed to work. And so if we want that system, we need to scale our organization down. Maybe that means radical federalism. Maybe it means a more confederal model. Maybe it ultimately means that parts of the United States as we understand it fall away. We don't really know what the future holds, but we do know is we have to return to this more virtuous and organic social organization. And I think ultimately that means taking some of the lessons of Machiavelli, but also, like we said, turning them towards an end that ultimately puts us back in a position where we can cultivate virtue, we can aim for the transcendent, we can build organizations that are meaningful to our lives and are not shaping people in a way that can simply where they can consume and produce and wither away in these kind of deracinated and isolated individualistic societies.
I think that's a great spot to end. Thanks so much, Auron.
Thanks for having me.